Today we're going to be looking at lesson 7, 5, 10, and we're going to be looking at how we multiply integers, so multiplying both positives and negatives. And in this first slide, we're being asked to tell which one does not belong. And you need to take a look at all four of these expressions. Now, technically, we could actually find a reason for each and every one of these not to belong. So go ahead and take a look and see if you can find just one of them that you don't think doesn't belong and give your thinking. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at a reason why this first one doesn't belong. And when I'm looking at this one, the first thing I'm noticing is that 7.9x. That actually means that we're taking the number 7.9 or 7 and 9 tenths and we're multiplying it by x. So when I look at this, I could say that it's really the only one, it's the only expression where we're multiplying a number times x. This is adding. This one doesn't have any variable, and this one doesn't have a variable. So that's one reason why we might say that this one doesn't belong. The second one, we could say that this is the only one that uses addition, right? So the other ones, this is multiplying, and then this doesn't have an operation. For this problem, we could say, oh, well, look, it's the only one that has parentheses, right? It's also the only one where we're multiplying by a negative number. And finally, I could say that this one doesn't belong simply because it's the only one that doesn't have an operation in it, meaning it's the only one that we aren't adding, subtracting, multiplying, or dividing. So even though these all look somewhat similar, they all have 7.9 in them, or the numbers 7 and 9. Oh, there's another reason why this one could not belong. It uses the number 79 as opposed to 7.9 or 7 and 9 tenths. So either way, any of those reasons can tell us why one doesn't belong. So let's kind of take a look at the next slide. Here we're looking at multiplying negative numbers, right? So this is saying, give an example of multiplication problem with a product. So remember, product means the answer to a multiplication problem that's greater than 1. Okay, so you could have a million different answers for this, right? So we could say 3 times 1. That gives us an answer greater than 1. I could also say negative 3 times negative 1. There's another one, right? 2 negatives, when you multiply them, we get a positive, right? So there's really, you could multiply any two positive whole numbers, as long as it's not 1 times 1, and you're going to get something bigger than 1. You could also multiply two negative numbers together and still get a positive. For this one, give a multiplication problem with a product less than 1. The first thing I think of here is I could take the number 1 and multiply it by any fraction that's less than 1 and get an answer that they're looking for, like 1 times 1/2, right? 1 times 1/2 is going to give us 1/2 because any number times 1 equals the number that you multiply it by, right? And this is less than 1, right? I was also thinking, well, what if I did negative 7 times 2? If I did negative 7 times 2, my answer is negative 14. And any negative number is less than 1, right? So technically, I can multiply many different numbers where if I have any number, like let's say 4 times negative 5, that's negative 20, right? As long as I'm multiplying a positive and a negative number together, I'm going to end up with a negative number. which is less than 1. So again, there's many, 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 many different answers to this. Now, this is saying we want a number between 0 and 1. Okay? This is a little bit trickier because we know between 0 and 1, my answer has to be positive, right? These are positive numbers, but they have to be less than 1. So we could do 1 times a half, like I said before, right? Any number 1/2 times, let's say, a fourth, right? A lot of fractions. This would be, you multiply across for multiplying fractions. So this would be 1/8, right? So we're still looking at more than 0, but less than 1. Um, I could use negatives for this as well, as long as the answer is positive, right? So we could do -1/2 times negative, let's say, 2/3, right? If I'm multiplying two negatives, my answer is positive. This gives me the answer of 2/6, or this simplifies to 1/3. Okay, so there's lots of ways to get something bigger than 0 but less than 1. Okay, this one is saying, what? Give me a number between -1 and 0. Okay, so I know that answer is actually negative. So this is kind of like the opposite of what we just did here, meaning we could actually keep these numbers, but flip the signs, right? So we know we need a negative answer for this. So for instance, what if I did -1 times 2/3, right? That's going to equal, well, this is a -1 and this is a positive, so the answer is negative, and then 1 times 2/3 is just 2/3, so the answer is -2/3. So it's still going to be bigger than -1, but it's less than 0, right? I could do -4/7 times, let's say, a positive, because I need my number to be negative, right? And this is going to give me negative, because a negative times a positive is a negative, 4/21, right? That's still, it's going to be less than 0, but it's still more than -1. So again, there's many, many, many different answers for this. Okay, so now that we're thinking about those, remembering our rules, right? So a negative times a positive is a negative. If we have two positive numbers, well, that equals um, two negatives equals a positive, two positives equals a positive, right? So we're basically now going to have to sort some cards. So there's groups of 3 where they all equal the same thing, right? So you're trying to find out the cards that match up with each other. So this is probably going to be a good one to have a paper for, so that you can try out your answers and have a record of what each card is equal to, right? So here's what we can do here for this one. Like, let's just start with one. Let's start with this one up here. So remember, a dot simply means multiply. So if we have a -2 times 6, that means, well, -2 times 6 is 12. And if we have a positive and a negative, the answer is negative, right? So we know this card is going to be worth -12. Um, so we could go ahead and try to search for cards that are also -12. That's fine. You can do that. I like to go ahead and just look at cards, solve them, and then put them where they belong. So, like, for instance, this next one is 2 times 4. Well, I know that's 8. We don't have a match for 8 yet, so let's just make a new little kind of column to put it under, right? Let's solve this one. Now, this is a little different because we have 3 numbers. Now, we're still multiplying, but there's 3 of them. So, really, all we have to do is kind of go in order, or it doesn't matter if multiplying, you can multiply these two first and then multiply by -1, or you could do these two first and then multiply by 6. The order doesn't matter when you're multiplying. So for this one, let's just take a look. So -2 times 6 is -12, right? Because well, we just did it right here. It's -12. But then we have to take that answer and multiply it by -1. So -12 times -1 is actually +12. So I have to make a new column for that one. So this is a +12. So really you multiply them in any order. Okay, so this one we have a -3 times 5. Well, I know 3 times 5 is 15, and then I know, well, a negative times a positive is a negative. So the answer is -15. Okay, let's look at this one. For this one, we have -1 times -12. So I already know my answer is positive because I have two negatives. And then 1 times 12 is 12. So that's a +12. So I have my first match. This goes under this column. Okay. There we go. Now, let's look at this one. We have a -1 times a +12. So a negative times a positive is a negative, and 1 times 12 is 12. So the answer is -12. So these guys match together. Okay, let's look at this one. So for this one, again, there's you can multiply them in any order. I can start here. So like -1 times -3. Well, a negative and a negative is a positive, and 1 times 3 is 3. So this is +3. So now we've done that. We take the 3 and multiply it by -5. So I know that +3 times -5 is actually -15. And that we can attach here. Okay. So next, let's see, I'll get rid of that. Next we have, let's see, I'm going to do the easier ones. I don't know if you guys like doing that or not. I like to look at these and I go, fractions. I'm going to hold off on that. All right. I'm going to do the easy ones that I can do in my head first. So like this one, we have a positive times a positive. So we know it's going to be a positive number and it's 15. We don't have a 15 pile yet, so we'll make a new one. Okay. And that's positive 15. And then, like, let's take a look. This has a fraction. We're going to hold off for a second. All right, let's look at this one. So here we have a -1 times a -3. So those together are going to make a +3, right? So we have +3 times -4. So 3 times 4 is 12, and then that's a -12. So that tells me we can move this one to -12. And that's good because that rounds out that group. We're done with that group. Okay. Let's take a look here at the next one. We have -3 times -5. Okay, so we have two negatives, which means the answer is going to be a positive. And 3 times 5 is 15, so that's a +15. So that's going to go over here. Okay, and let's take a look at this one. We have 2 times -4. So a positive times a negative is going to be a negative. And 2 times 4 is 8, so this is a -8. We actually don't have a -8 column yet. So let's make one. We'll put it here. Okay. All right, let's take a look at this one. 1 times -15. So again, I have a positive times a negative, so the answer will be negative. And 1 times 15 is 15, so it's -15. And looks like we're done with that one as well because we have 3 in each one. Okay, and it looks like we have, all right, we're getting there, right? So let's take a look here. We have 3 numbers. So let's do +1 times -3. So that's -3, right? Times -5. So -3 times -5 is actually +15. So we're going to put that over there. And let's see, this also has some whole numbers, so let's try this out. So there's three of them, but it's -1 times -3. So that's a +3. And then +3 times 4 is going to be a +12. Okay. So I've kind of gotten rid of all my easy ones, right? So now I'm just left with these four to try out. So I'm just gonna pull one off here. There's lots of different ways you could go about solving these, and it's truly up to you on how you do this. Um, we're multiplying, right? So without a calculator, we know well. First thing we know a negative times a positive. We know the answer has to be a negative number, right? But what is half? And then I don't know if you guys remember, we had talked before. Multiply means of. So some of you might be able to just do this in your head, and you might know that half of 16 is 8, right? So therefore, the answer to this is -8 because of the negative, right? So half of 16 is 8. Now, if you don't know that, and that's fine if you don't, we're going to multiply. So when we multiply fractions, we have to turn this one into a fraction. 16 is not a fraction. And to turn a whole number into a fraction, you really just put it over 1. Okay? The reason being, you need 16 wholes, right? In a fraction, the bottom number is how many parts make a whole. So in this case, we know it takes 1 part to make a whole. And then the top number is 16 parts. So that's telling us that there are 16 parts. If there's 16 parts and each one makes a whole, this is still worth 16 wholes. Okay? So now we have this fraction that we can multiply. The rules for multiplying fractions means you just multiply across. It's way easier than adding and subtracting. We multiply across and we get 16 over 2, which hopefully you know is actually a division problem, right? 16, this division bar, the fraction bar means divide. So if you have 16 and you divide it by 2, you get 8, right? So when we do the numbers, 1/2 times 16, we get 8. And then it's still going to be negative because we're doing a negative times a positive. So this card is going to go with our -8. Okay? So now, actually, I'm going to hold off because I just saw something here. Well, I'm going to pull this card over because this card is very similar to this one, except it's a -16 instead of a +16, right? So this work here is the same. 1/2 times 16. 1/2 times 16 is 8. And then we look to see, is this answer for this problem going to be positive or negative? We're multiplying a negative times a negative, which means the answer is a positive. So this matches up with +8. And now I think I can erase this work. Okay, so let's take a look at the next card. Let's do this one. So again, there's different ways you can do this. What's 1/4 of 32? Okay, so you could consider that. Or you can do the math of like for instance, I'm going to even show you a bar model for this one. This means of, right? The multiplication means of. So if you were to have a bar model and the whole thing is 32 because it says 1/4 of 32. Well, 1/4. They're saying if we break this into fourths, you break 32 into fourths, what is just 1/4? 1 out of the 4, right? So to solve for a box here, we have to know, oh, well, look, we just took 32 and divided it into 4 equal parts. So this number, there's 8 in each part here, right? So 1/4 of 32 is actually, it's still 8, just kind of like our last one, right? We do have to double check. We have a negative times a negative. So our answer is going to be a positive. So we do know this is going to be 8. Again, you could do this the same way also that we did the last one, which was 1/4 times 32, which looks something like this, right? 32 over 1. When we multiply the numerators. So this is 32, and then the denominators, which is 4. And lo and behold, we end up coming up with the same idea here. We have to take 32. This means divide. So 32 divided by 4 is actually 8. And again, it's still positive because there's two negatives. So this guy is also going to go under our positive 8, and we're done with the 8s, which means this has to be, we're going to hope, it has to fall under -8, but we're going to double check our work here. So let's see here. Now we're finding 64 times an eighth, and it's -64 times 1/8. So we have to remember that 64 times a positive. So a negative times a positive, we're looking for a negative answer here, which is good because that's what we think it is. And we need to go ahead and multiply. So let's do 64, and we know that this is over 1, times 1/8, right? We just multiply across, and we get 64 over 8, right? Because 64 times 1 is 64, 1 times 8 is 8. And then again, I know this means to divide, so the answer of this is 8. And then we add the negative from knowing, oh, a negative times a positive is a negative. So this does actually match up with our -8, which is great because we need 3 of each. So that is how we solve all of those problems. All right, so now you're going to be practicing what you just did, where you're going to multiply and you're going to be checking in um, to see, you're going to check in, you do the multiplication, find the product. The product, remember, is the answer to a multiplication problem. And then this is going to tell you whether you're correct or not. So go ahead and try that. You have plenty of spaces down here for you to show your work to do the multiplication. All right, and we're going to go ahead. I'm going to show you how to do each one. So the first one is fraction multiplication. And the first thing I'm noticing is I'm multiplying two negatives. So I know my answer is going to be a positive. So for this, I'm going to go ahead. I have 620ths over times 2, right? Or 2 over 1, which is the same thing as 2. So when I'm doing this, we can go ahead and do the multiplication. We multiply across. So 600 times 2 is 1,200. And then 20 times 1 is 20. So we're left with 1,200 over 20. I imagine, and let's just try this out, we could put that in, and it turns correct. The one thing that I would consider, and I would hope that you would consider doing, is knowing that this is not in lowest terms. If I wanted to put this into lowest terms, we're basically saying, what's a better way of writing this fraction? What can we divide both 1,200 by and 20, right, to make this a lower number? And the first thing that we can do is if we divide both the numerator and the denominator by tens, we can get rid of these a 0. So that's going to give us 120 over 2, okay, if we divide both by 10, which really we're dividing by 1, right, because 10 divided by 10, or 10 over 10 is 1. So that still, I know, is not the lowest that we can get this number. I also know that 120 over 2, well, I know that if 2 make a whole and I have 120 pieces, if I just take the 120 pieces and I put them into groups of 2, so I'm dividing them by 2, I'm going to get 60 full wholes. So 120 over 2 is 60, which technically I could have done 1200 divided by 20 and got 60 right away. And notice, so 100, 1,220ths is the same thing as just 60. Okay. So those are going to give me, notice they're both correct because they're both equivalent. Um, so now let's take a look at the next one. We have negative 7/8 times 1/10. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to forget about the signs first. I'm just going to do the multiplying and then we'll go from there. So I know I just multiply across. So I get 7 times 1 is 7. 8 times 10 is 80. So we're left with 7/80ths. Gosh, and I think that's about as simple as it's going to get. Here we do a negative times a positive. So my answer is actually going to be a negative 7/80ths. Okay. All right. So now we've got three. So for this one, we're doing negative 3 times negative 2.5 times negative 10. So remember what I said. It's you can choose what order to multiply, right? It doesn't matter if we do negative 3 times negative 2.5 first, or if we do negative 2.5 times negative 10, which actually I'm going to choose to do only because I know if I multiply by 10, because I am forgetting about the negative signs for right now. If I do 10 times 2.5, I actually know that that's going to make this just 25, right? It's going to make that decimal jump over, right, to here. So negative 2.5 times 10 is 25. All right. And the negative and the negative make a positive number. So it truly is 25. So now I'm left with negative 3 times 25. So I know this is like quarters, right? If I have 3/4, I actually have 75. So here I've done mental math. Now, is it positive or negative? Well, it's negative because I have a negative times a positive. So my answer there is going to be a negative 75. Okay. Now let's go ahead and try this one. We have 3.5 times 8, negative 8 at that. Okay. So for this one, the problem I'm seeing here is if I'm multiplying fractions, I really want to have both, like this is a mixed number. So I'm going to take 3.5 and I'm actually going to make it into a fraction, right? So, and you can envision this if you're not sure of what I'm doing next. I'm going to show you here. Here I have shaded 3 holes, not well, but 3 holes plus an extra half, right? But I want to make these so that they're all in halves. So I don't want to have the holes anymore. I want to make them into halves to see how many total I have. So since this is already in a half, so I'm going to cut this in half, this in half, and this in half. Okay, and if I'm looking at that, now I'm trying to figure out how many halves do I have, right? So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 3.5 is the same thing as 7 halves because look, there's 2 halves in one whole, right? So 2, 4, 6, and then just that half makes 7. So I'm going to use 7 halves times, and we're going to do 8. So it's just 8 over 1, right? And when I multiply, I'm going to end up with 56 halves. Okay. And this is not lowest terms. I could put it in here, but it's not lowest terms, right? Um, in order to make this lowest terms, I know, well, let's see. If I start taking these 56 halves, because that's like saying I have 56 of these halves, right? Each little half. So if I put those into groups of 2, if I divide it, right, into groups of 2, how many groups of 2 will I get? Well, let's see. I will get 28 groups. So this is actually equal to the number 28 wholes. Okay, so 56 halves is 28 wholes. Now, is it a positive or negative? It's a negative because I have a negative times a positive, so it's a negative. So we're going to put that in here. And there we go. We got the right answer. All right, let's move on to the next one. So here we have 80 times negative zero point 0.8 or 8 tenths times negative 1. Okay. So again, it doesn't matter what order I do these in. I actually think I'm going to go ahead and try this one because I know multiplying by a negative 1 is easy. So I'll do negative 1 times negative 0.08. Well, I already know it's going to be positive because it's a negative times a negative is a positive. So I also know if I multiply by 1, we get the same thing, right? So it's going to be 0.8, and it is positive since they're both negatives that we're multiplying. So now I'm left with 80 times 8 tenths, okay? So I'm just going to go ahead and come over here and do that. So 80 times 0.8, all right? I'm just going to multiply, and they're both positive, so the answer will be positive anyway. So 8 times 0 is 0. 8 times 8 is 64. Okay. Now, I could go ahead and do this one. 0 times 0 is 0. 0 times 8 is 0. I could do that, but it's still going to be 0. Okay. I also see that there's one number behind this decimal point back here, which means I have to move my decimal point from here over to here. So I know my answer is actually 64. Okay. The other way I might know that is 80 times, well, this is close to 1, right? So 80 times 1 is about 80. So I'd have to move that decimal point in my answer so that it would make sense for the number to be close to 80. So in this case, it's 64. So my answer, positive 64. Okay. And finally, here we are in our last one. We have lots of numbers and we're multiplying. So I tell you what, let's start here. And I'm not going to make this simple to begin with. And I'm just going to automatically know that, okay, what if I did my negative 1 and my negative 6? I multiply negative 6 times negative 1 and I get positive 6, right? So now I'm going to be left with these three numbers to multiply. So we have 6 times negative 4.5 times negative 0.5, which is also a half, right? Oh, that's hard. It doesn't look like a 0.5, but it is. Okay, so again, we can multiply in any order that we would like. Okay, so let's go ahead and just do 4.5 times 0.5. Or times 0.5, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and multiply. I take my 5 times 5 is 25. 4 times 5, I'm forgetting about these decimals, by the way. So 4 times 5 is 20, plus 2 is 22, okay? Now, I don't have to do a second row here because if I do, 0 times 5 it's going to be 0. Okay, and we're going to add 0 to 225 and we get the same thing. So we don't really have to do that. Okay, now placing the decimal is a little different here. We have this 5 is behind a decimal and this 5 is behind a decimal, right? So there's two ways to do this. I know that I'm looking at something that's going to be about, well, this is about 5. 4.5 is close to 5. And 5 times 0.5 rounds to 1 is going to be about 5, right? So we know our number has to be close to 5 wholes. Well, the only place to put a decimal in 225 to make it, the answer close to an estimate of 5 is right here, right? It's after this first two. And that matches up with the other way I would do it. We have two fives or two numbers behind a decimal. So therefore we move our decimal over twice and we end up with 2.25. Now, let's see, we aren't finished yet because that's just the very first part here, right? So we did 4.5, negative 4.5 times negative zero point 0.5. We know this is equal to 2.25, and it is positive because two negatives make a positive, right? When we're multiplying. So now we're just left to take our 2.25, and now we have to multiply it by 6. So I am going to put this, set it up like this. I like to put the one digit, the less digits go on the bottom here, and let's multiply. 6 times 5 is 30. 6 times 2 is 12. Plus 3 is 15. And then we have 12 plus 1 is 13. And then now again, I have to place a decimal. Well, I know if I'm taking 2.25 is close to 2, right? So we know our answer has to be close to 2 times 6, and 2 times 6 is 12. So I've got to figure out, where do I put a decimal in this number to make it closest to 12? Well, it's going to go here. And let's double check. Look, we've got two numbers behind a decimal point. So we would move this over twice, once, twice, which would leave it there. So our answer is 13.5 or 13.50. And it is positive because, well, we did a positive times a positive. And that gave us all of our products. So let's move on. Okay. And here we have some more work with multiplying, right? And we're going to follow the same steps that we just did on the previous problem. Now, what I am going to do, instead of just giving you the answers for all of these, I do want to show you, I want to look at, can we predict whether these will be positive or negative answers? So that's what we're going to do on this one. So instead of finding the actual answer, I want to decide, are these going to be a positive answer or a negative answer? So for here, we have, this means divide, right? So if we're dividing a positive divided by a positive, the answer will be a positive. Okay, so we know, and actually I'll just put this in, this is going to be a positive answer. Okay, for here, we have a negative times a positive. If you do negative times positive, you come up with a negative. For this one, we have a positive times a negative. So if you have opposites like that, it's going to be negative. Again, we have a positive times a negative, so the answer is negative. Here, since we have 3, we kind of have to think about this, right? So if we did negative 10 times 3.2, that's going to give us a negative answer because the negative times a positive is a negative. So now we know we have a negative answer times a negative answer. So that's actually going to give us a positive answer. Over here, we have a positive times a positive, so the answer is also positive. We have, now don't let these parentheses fool you. They're really just saying, okay, we have 0.1 times negative 60. So if we have those two things, we have a positive times a negative, which is a negative. Here we have a negative times a positive, which is a negative. A negative times a positive, they're opposites, so it's a negative. And then here again, we have to go through this. We know 5 times a positive times a negative is a negative, so this is going to give us a negative answer. So then we'd have a negative times a negative, which is actually a positive. Okay, so those are what we're going to get for these particular problems here. Okay, let's move on. So, in summary, if we multiply a negative by a positive, the product, simply the answer, is going to be a negative. Okay? Write a multiplication equation showing this using fractions. So you could write any fraction multiplication equation to show that. You might even consider going back and looking for examples in what we've already done, right? There's one right there. Negative 7/8 times positive 1/10 gives us a negative answer. Okay. All right. Next, if you multiply two negative numbers, the product will be positive. Write a multiplication equation showing this using decimals. Well, again, I suggest go back and try to find some that show that, right? Here's some decimals that show two positives or two negatives, right? When you multiply three negative numbers, the product is, okay, so we got to remember it's a negative times a negative times a negative. So these two negatives together make a positive. So then you have a positive times a negative. So your answer is a negative. You can give examples of that. It says using decimals and fractions. All right. Finally, I want you to tell me, what did you learn about multiplying numbers when you have one, two, or three or more negatives? So this is for your chance to tell me what you learned.